Hello, everyone. Dr. Jane here, your favorite psychologist. The conversation we're having today is going to be on brain and neglect and how that shows up for the child and how that shows up for them in adulthood. Very important conversation for us to have. So, understanding the difference between trauma and neglect. In trauma, sometimes that's a one-time event. Sometimes that is a, long-term chronic event, right? Series of events. And so, but in trauma, you have this um, overwhelming of a person's ability to cope. And that often results in emotional, cognitive, physiological dysregulation. And so, what trauma does, neglect does the same thing as well, or similar, but the route is different. And so, you have this dysregulation of the person's nervous system that impacts their development long term. In terms of neglect, neglect refers to a persistent failure of a caregiver to meet a child's basic needs. And so they fail to show up for the child. They fail to show up physically, they fail to show up emotionally, they fail to show up psychologically, and with basic needs such as food, clothes, shelter, supervision, emotional support, educational needs, and so forth. The adult or the caregiver in the person's life fail to show up. Now, neglect is sometimes harder to see because then it doesn't become obvious till after a period of time. It's not like when we're looking at physical abuse where there are these markers and stuff like that, where we can see, okay, someone is being abused. Neglect is so much more harder to show and to say. Um, in both cases, we have a dysregulation of the nervous system, and we have um, the person may have developed different adaptations and coping strategies, you know, in these particular situations. And so that is the crux of the conversation that I wanted to have today, because then that dysregulation that occurs for the individual is very pronounced as time goes by. So, talking about the outcome being pronounced. So, we have the brains here of two individuals, two 3-year-old children. And if you notice, one is so much more larger than the other. And it is larger because of the child's experiences. Now, we as parents have to consistently give input into our children. We feed them, we nurture them, we care for them, we talk to them. And as we're doing those things, the brain is able to grow as it should. These two brains here are of two 3-year-old children. One has normal development and the other experienced extreme neglect. And when you hear about, so there are words that you would hear in cognitive psych, in neuroscience, you would hear about the architecture of the brain, the chemistry of the brain, but what does that mean? And what are the implications for the individuals? So if I'm looking at this brain for these two individuals, and one is larger than the next, the size of the brain determines or matters in terms of what this child can and cannot do. Because in this case, they're not working with the same capacity. One is larger than the next. And so they're not working with the same capacity because that capacity is not there because one is larger than the next. Now, when we talk about the architecture of the brain, we're talking about how the brain is put together. So when you think about a house, right? We walk into this house and we see huge vaulted ceiling, and it's made of concrete as opposed to wood. And you have all these nice designs in this huge house. And then you go to maybe an apartment, and the apartment is a basic apartment with nothing distinctive about it. And the way it was put together was, not with too much care. It was just put together. This is what we mean when we are talking about the architecture of a person's brain. How was it put together? Because dependent on how it was put together, that will also determine the person's ability to function and the part's ability to be able to interact and function together as they should. And so that's the architecture of the brain. We also have to think about neural density. How good are these neural connections between each other, and how many connections are there so that there is the transmission of information and messages from one neuron to the other, and we have quick transmission or very slow transmission or none at all, dependent on the neural density. How many neurons are there and how connected are they? The other piece that we are looking at is the chemistry of the brain. If I have such a small brain compared to the larger one, I am not making the amount of chemicals and neurotransmitters in the brain that I need in order to function at my optimal. Because again, the capacity simply is not there for that to happen. And so, very important when we're looking at the person who experiences neglect as a child and how that show up in their lives. Neglect hurts the brain because then as that child is or should be or should have been learning how to form relationships, how to form friendships, how to think for themselves, and so forth. It didn't happen because due to neglect, those things were not built in the individual. I'll give you an example. Let's talk about language. In language, we have to have that return and serve, return and serve. So the language between the caregiver and the child, the caregiver and the child. And so even though this child's words are not clear, the child is babbling, 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 and the caregiver said, yes, I understand what you're saying. And it's babbling songs, but there is this return and serve back and forth between the child and the caregiver. And so the child not only learn how to speak, but the child also learns to comprehend, and the child learns the meaning of words and what things mean when they say it and what things mean when they hear it. All of that is impacted in neglect. And that's only one of the systems that is sometimes impacted when an individual experiences neglect or when they experience maltreatment, when they experience trauma, or when they experience um, betrayal, right? Infants need relationships with a consistent, emotionally available caregiver. And so it's interesting sometimes we have parents who are there physically, but they're not there emotionally. They're not present. And even though they're there, they're not engaging with this child as they should. And so the child doesn't receive all of the input that they need to have from the people around them. And that impacts the development, the brain development of the child and the nervous system development of this individual. And so majority of the changes to the brain following abuse and neglect are adaptations to an adverse environment rather than irreparable damage. And so sometimes in some cases, because they are adaptations, they are repairable. Um, and so this is where therapy comes in. This is where putting the work comes in. When we are thinking about emotional abuse, this is one of the outcomes of parental betrayal. We are looking at this chronic pattern of behavior such as belittling the child or humiliating the child or ridiculing the child, as opposed to neglect, where the person is consistently providing, or not providing, sorry, the support, attention, and affection that this child needs, that the child needs in order for them to properly develop, for them to properly learn, and for their nervous system to be developed as it needs to be developed. Now, emotional neglect, we see it as um, an individual is having difficulty expressing their emotion. This is how it shows up in our lives. A person having difficulty asking for help. A person, especially a young person, wants to be independent. We see it in where an individual blame themselves for everything, and where a person lacks compassion for their own self. And so they take on 50 million things that they have no business taking on, because then they're trying to show their worth or their value. How do we overcome emotional neglect? We have to be aware of our emotions. Where are we in terms of this particular situation? What do we think about it? What do we feel about it? We also have to learn to love ourselves, um, and forgive ourselves for whatever. We also have to do some things nice for ourselves. So we pamper ourselves, and we must be patient with ourselves. If we didn't get something right or whatever, it's okay. We try again. This adverse childhood experiences, fascinating work out of Dr. Burke's work, and she came up with this concept of adverse childhood experiences called ACEs. And for her, and out of her work, and please go and look at her work. Just search Dr. Burke's adverse childhood experiences. And out of her work, we are able to see and quantify how childhood experiences, adverse childhood experiences, shows itself long term in a person's health. Absolutely fascinating work. I love her work. Um, what comprises of ACEs? Abuse. This is physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. What constitute neglect? Neglect, physical and emotional neglect, household dysfunction, mental illness, someone who is incarcerated, the mother treated or treating the person violently or poorly, substance abuse, divorce. Um, and so those are the different childhood experiences that comprises of ACEs. Now, there's a triangle here, and you guys can make this triangle larger if you need to. And as we move up the triangle, generational embodiment, historical trauma, and we see that when we see that in the individual. And so that is present at the time of conception. The social conditioning, local context. So, what is happening in the immediate vicinity or home of the mom, and what is happening in the neighborhood of the mother? Adverse childhood experiences. Did they have one, two, three, four of these experiences? And if and when they have those experiences as a child, there is a disrupted neural development. And so now we have the disruption of the person's nervous system development. And out of that disruption, this is where we see social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. What does that mean? If an individual have cognitive impairment, that means they may not make good decisions. That means that they may not have the ability to fully read and comprehend. And so if they have difficulty reading and fully comprehending, that is going to impact the decisions that they are going to make, because then they are making decisions based on limited information. Socially, are they socially awkward? How do they navigate the world? And then we move up the pyramid, adaptation of health risk behaviors. The person engage in risky health behaviors. They may not go to the doctor frequently. They may do things that are not healthy or doesn't preserve their health. And then we move up to where it says disease and disability and social problems. The person, our ability to comprehend influences so much our ability to navigate our world. And this translates not only to relationships, our finances, but it also translates to our health. And if we're having, disease and disability, it takes the person to an early death. And so the conversation about us as parents ensuring certain things are in our order, teaching our children, training the children, and so forth. It's such an important conversation to have. Now we have this picture here, and I want you guys to look at this picture. Very big deal here, because in this picture, we are looking at the PET scan of two brains, one of a healthy brain, the other with an abused brain. And what the PET scan, the PET scan does, it actually looks at the functioning of an organ. So oxygen levels, it looks at the metabolism, oxygen use, and so forth. And all of these things determines or is an indicator of how well this organ is functioning. So here we have this brain, right? We have two diagrams here. One of a healthy brain, and the other is from a person who experienced abuse. And this is a person that came out of the um, orphanage in Romania. And I want you to look at these two brains. You see this area here that's black? There is nothing going on there. As opposed to, you see this, the one in the healthy one, we have all kinds of things going, and we have smaller areas of inactivity. The child that came out of the orphanage, um, in that time, in those orphanages, there was a large number of caregivers to children. And so a lot of those children in those orphanages, they weren't touched. You know how you hold a baby? They weren't held, they weren't talked to, they weren't cared for, and so the emotional support that they needed and the different things that they needed as children, they did not receive those input. And so what we saw in those individuals as adults, we saw many emotional and cognitive problems in the individual. And so please, please, please read to your children, talk with them, spend time with them. And when I say talk with them, they are talking with you as well. And engage them in all different types of conversations. It is important, and it's so much more important than we realize. If you like this content, please like, share, comment, subscribe. Please send your stories to parentalbetrayal500@gmail.com. Thank you so much for watching. I am Dr. Jane, and I am your favorite psychologist. Thank you so much for watching.